Welcome all to another installment of OWASP DevSlop Down Under edition. In today's exciting episode, sans music, we'll be talking about a topic which surely gets everyone's blood pumping, documentation. We'll be talking to our guest Heidi Waterhouse about the security considerations of documentation for attackers, defenders, and developers alike. Hello, Heidi.
Hey, hello.
How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great.
Good. Yeah. We are too, I think, hopefully. Yeah. We're live on the internet. I don't know. It's always kind of weird, but we'll deal. So we prepared this conversation. Well, not really it's a conversation and not a presentation. Because we wanted to chat with Heidi specifically about documents and documentation. Heidi has just written an entire whole book about this. Do you have a copy just like handy that you prepared earlier? This one? Yeah.
Yes.
Docs for developers.
Yes. It has a cute dog. In case you're on the fence about buying it, there's a good dog.
There's a dog? All right.
Yeah.
I was not aware of this part of it.
Docs, and it has a dog. Okay.
Yes, it has a little corgi whose name is Ein.
Oh, that's amazing.
Very good. Yeah.
But so we wanted to chat with you about documentation, not just because it is not just for developers, but it is also for hackers as well, and hackers use it in lots of different ways. And given that you're on a call with a bunch of people who have variously been described as hackers with or without air quotes over the years, we would really like to hear your thoughts about how it is, like how hackers use documentation, the kind of things that you can that can go wrong with it, and how you get it right. So in terms of the way that hackers use documentation, I know that doing pen testing, docs are one of the most useful things that you can do, because quite often they have a lot of really handy things in there, like default credentials that nobody changes. Or configuration suggestions that actually aren't great, and things like that. But I'm wondering, in your experience, whether this is a trend that is changing, or whether this is something that is still a big problem in documentation that you see, and how you would recommend doing it differently, if at all.
So it's not going to change. The sad truth about being a technical writer is knowing that nobody wants to be reading what you wrote. If they are reading what you wrote, it's probably because something has gone very wrong in their day and they are already pissed off. Like this is the true nature of documentation. Pretty much everyone who's reading it is already pissed off because something didn't work the way they expect. So technical writers have a little bit of fatalism about who it is that reads their docs. When it comes to security considerations, it's not something we get trained on preventing. We're like, you know what I'd like? I'd like it if somebody read the docs, but failing that, I'd like it if the pissed off people could skim the docs enough to find out what they want. So while we put in all the things, we don't really think about people reading all the things. And that's just a failure mode of the way people interact with docs. The thing that is changing is we are not hiring as many technical writers as we used to. And we have a lot more threat surface in terms of both software and developer tools that is absolutely software, but also that we don't document as if it were software. And that is such a rich place to play, because when developers have written documentation, what they've written down is, if I have to wake up at 2 a.m. and solve something, what is it I need to know? And that's just like hacker candy. It's like, if I rolled up to you at 3 a.m. and these ports were open, how would that go for me? Because like the developers, even if they think about securing from outside attack, they seldom imagine anybody getting a hold of their documentation, much less actually reading it.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for like actually reading the manual, right? Like it's just literally well-written ones are just descriptions of how the system works. And if you're describing how the system works, including all the flaws in it, it's kind of like, oh, cool, interesting. I know Beck in particular enjoys a quiet evening in with the RFCs and a glass of wine. So
it's one of those things. It's really interesting to see like what has been written down, because that, I feel like that's a description of the ideal state. If everything went right, this is what we expect. And you always know, like with engineering, with everything, there's always drift. And so what you end up with this like fantastic divergence, and you see it in browsers. Like you have all of the specs. This is how like content security policy works. This is how headers work. This is how all of these things work. And then you have a million different browsers and they all do it slightly different, especially between like Chrome and Firefox. And then it's like, is this how it's meant to work? Because that's not what's described, but somehow I'm meant to accept this.
We need like an array voiceover so we can do like everything was not implemented consistently.
yeah. And like, and you see it as well. Like you see it with security issues where, you know, Firefox honors some headers, whereas Chrome doesn't. And so you also by proxy put engineers in this awkward position where they need to know the spec and how each of the different browsers work, so then they can implement something correctly across 5 different environments.
See above. They don't like reading the documentation.
Yeah.
Was it Ian Coldwater who found a really interesting way of messing with the IBM mainframe by reading the IBM mainframe documentation? Yeah,
they were telling me about this. I'm lucky enough to live in the same city as them, and they were describing this, and they said, yeah, what I did was I read the original documentation, and it was right there. It wasn't even a security hole. It was just there, but nobody had thought about that because the abstracted documentation, as we get further and further from that bare metal, loses a bit of fidelity. Yeah. And while it gains in accessibility and containerization and virtualization, there's also, it turns out, actual metal touching electrons somewhere in there. Yeah. And that's where a lot of the containerization VM vulnerabilities live, like down under the hypervisor. What's down there?
Yeah. Such an uncomfortable truth, I think, in this age of computer science.
Years ago, I went to a talk by Matthew Garrett, and it was like, I don't know, 2015 or something like that. And he's like, so VMs, this seems like a great idea, right? Except. And then the whole talk, I was just like, oh dear, oh no, I never thought about like escaping, right? Because if you tell me I made a virtual machine, I visualize it as a machine and not like a file on a Linux system, which is really what it is.
Yeah, like an area of memory that we're like, yeah, that's definitely just all by itself. That's
no connection to anything else, not at all. It's fine. This is probably fine. Oh, hello. Is this hello?
This is Director Fury, who came and yelled at me, so she gets to be on camera.
Also loves documentation, I bet.
Also loves documentation. She really likes it when I'm writing, because I frequently, if I'm writing documentation, it's late at night, and so I will sit still and turn on the heated blanket.
She has such opinions. I love her. One of the things that that's also really interesting to me about documentation is how people are like, all right, well, I feel like we have these kind of two opposing viewpoints where it's like, we'll write everything down and everybody, like nobody will read it except when they're mad at 2 a.m. So we'll highlight the prominent bits, or we can't write this down because of security reasons. And either way, I feel like you have problems. Like if you're hiding parts from your documentation, then people are going to misconfigure stuff. And if you don't, then people can read stuff and maybe do something wrong with it. So yeah, I don't know whether the security by obscurity thing actually means much when it comes to documentation. Like, should we be hiding it? Should we be putting more in? Is there how do we do it right? It feels like either way, nobody wins except the hackers.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to me. I have this whole tangent cam. I have this whole thing on how different educational systems train people to write differently. And when I was working on BitLocker, I was working with this incredibly brilliant German who did a bunch of the cryptography behind it. And that man would write everything down. Everything. I'm like, nobody wants a 60-page paper on AES. He's like, but that's what I have to say about it. Like, this is everything. And Americans are much more like, this is the minimum. You'll figure it out. And it turns out in Germany, the testing says every time you add something, it increases your score. Like when you add something correct. In American education, every time you add something incorrect, it decreases your score. And so we've trained these two houses alike in dignity to have totally different attitudes toward how documentation should go. And this is true, like every educational system has a different bias on this. So when we're talking about what we should put in, what we have to do is the same thing we have to do for all documentation, which is identify who the users are. And if we're honest with ourselves, the users aren't just us, and they aren't just people who are paying us money. They are people who are attacking our systems. And once we get that through our heads, it becomes a little easier to sort out, like whether you should keep something obscure, whether you should gate it, which won't work anyway, but it's worth a try. Whether you should make it harder to get that without having some kind of system access anyway.
One of the other things that came up when we were initially talking to you about this that I thought was super interesting was the way that people can probably don't think about documentation as an attack vector as well, which to me, like when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, it's a good point. Like I've been thinking about documentation from a hacking point of view as something that can really help me understand a system and understand where the vulnerabilities and the flaws might be. But thinking about how you might actually cause systemic issues by messing with the documentation itself was entirely new to me.
Right. It's sort of the old, what if we change the road signs and somebody goes the wrong direction? Like a Warner Brothers cartoon, but so much more sophisticated, because if somebody gets in and points your default port setting to their bad place, who's going to know? After we talked about this, I thought about it more, and this works much better with richer documentation, which tends to come with more sophisticated user-facing software. But there are documentation sets that have live databases behind them. And if you get into that database, you're not getting into the production database, but you are getting a lot of insight into how the software thinks it is, because you're doing what we call contextual help. So, when you're on a web page and you go, was this page useful? And you say, no, that's a context. You're like, I know which page you found unhelpful. But also sometimes when you're in very shiny end user software, which probably none of you ever use, it's like, hey, it's almost Clippy-like. Is this what you want help with on this particular screen? Okay, I can help you with that. I know where you are. I'm going to deliver advice for that particular screen, which is super useful. But also you have to have so much context associated with that what an attacker could have. First of all, nobody secures that, because malicious documentation reading is really right down on our list of security threats. Like, oh no, people will read our documentation. No, we're not worried about that. Whether or not we should be. Lock it down. It's not going to take you long. Lock it down. But so we don't secure against that. And if you got in and saw that there was like this whole hidden Fed section where the instructions, the help for the federal system was segregated off, but you could still see it because it was documentation, you would know a lot about that system. You would have all the instructions for all the pages and all the screen caps and everything.
Ah, yes, the forbidden docs.
Exactly. Very exciting. Exotic.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
I found something similar to that. Sorry,
no,
Lily. I was just going to say, just a total aside, I found something similar to that recently, actually, just with developers using certain libraries to generate KPI code as boilerplate. especially with like the prevalence of GraphQL these days.
No.
I've noticed, yeah, that like a lot of, I guess, unintended side effects of using some of that boilerplate generation is that you get a lot of code comments swept up as documentation that then gets exposed to anyone who looks. That's been very interesting.
Your CI/CD system. Like that's a really interesting injection attack. Like if I put out a great Confluence template and people copied the whole thing in, and then it got read by the Confluence system, all those comments that nobody ever saw, how much have you injected?
Yeah.
And I mean, you also have all of the nice features of Confluence, like, macros, HTML, iframe embedding,
macros,
and it makes for a good vector that I don't think a lot of people think about, because it's like, why would anyone want to backdoor docs? Like, no one even reads them anyway. No one makes nice templates, so why would they do bad things there as well?
Right.
Yeah.
But whomst among us has not downloaded a template that's like 90% of what we want and uploaded it and filled it out and been like, okay, good to go.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about like the Hacktoberfest thing, where a lot of people flood GitHub repositories with low value commits that are quite often like one-line documentation changes. And how often, honestly, like if you come in with something that does actually correct valid things, if you're starting to then insert stuff like, by the way, configure it like this, don't turn on blah blah blah, I don't know, removing things, that could be a really valid thing as well. Well, valid in the sense of, as an attack vector, it would be a really interesting one. I know that so serverless, for example, like the serverless documentation has got instructions in it that lead people to misconfigure it all the time. And it is stuff that unless you're really experienced and you've had a lot of context with it, you're probably just going to misconfigure it right out of the box if you're following their documentation the way that it's written. And there is a lot of stuff where it's just assumed knowledge, and that also causes these gaps. But it would be easy enough to remove a line here or there to increase the chances of it being misconfigured. I think that's like a really long game kind of attack strategy, but it is something that could really pay off.
So here's a thing that I literally did last night. I am a bad security monkey. I decided that I need to crack my Kindle books, because I do this every couple of years and download all my Kindle books in a readable EPUB format. And every couple of years, like Amazon and I are in an arms race. And by I mean Apprentice Alf, the god of Kindle cracking. And I found the instructions again, and it's like, okay, download Calibre. Okay, Calibre, I know, that's fine. Download this plugin and load it into Calibre. And my computer's like, hey, you downloaded that from the internet. Did you mean to download that from the internet? Just checking. Did you really want to run that? And I'm like, yes, of course I did. I downloaded it. I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah, grab all these random DLLs from this Adobe product that, you need an old version, so you need to get it off this like weird FTP site and just go for it.
Right. There's nothing as dangerous as a motivated amateur.
Yeah, it's like drugs testing. It's kind of like, we know people are going to do the thing anyway. Why can't we just make it safer for them to do it if they're going to do it at all, and avoid a lot of these other issues? Why can't they document the piracy documentation better? Right?
Why isn't there better checking on the piracy documentation? I think of this as, so I teach junior high comprehensive sex ed, and we think of this as harm reduction. Like, it turns out teenagers have poorly developed frontal cortexes and a lot of hormones, and they're not always going to make good choices. You can tell them to make good choices. You can incentivize them to make good choices. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So what you have to do is make it so that when they make bad choices, which they will, it's not catastrophic. Yeah. So this is sort of that Swiss cheese layer of disease mitigation. It shows up in all sorts of places to say, you're never going to entirely seal off your documentation. You're never going to get their kids to keep their pants on. How can we make it less bad?
Love that as a parallel.
Yes. And I think it's those
Fantastic.
really sort of I don't want to say simple things because I think that oversimplifies the problem, but it's like, when you wake up at 2:00 in the morning to fix a problem, make sure any sensitive configuration files are in 1Password or like whatever corporate password manager you're using, and then having like a link that someone can click that prompts them to log in and all of these things. So even if, hackers end up with their hands on the docs, they can't actually really get anywhere. They can't look at how things are configured. They can't log into anything, but they know that these processes exist.
Right.
And it's, it makes a lot of sense. Sorry, Lily, you go.
Oh, no, I was just thinking also that it would be super interesting. Like, I don't know how often people look at things like Stack Overflow as a supply chain attack vector. But the number of people that copy stuff out
How
of
much
Stack
of
Overflow
open
is
source
like,
code and it is out there in your products that has just been copy pasted? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting attack vector.
Stack Overflow specifically, though, where you've got like just small snippets. I know that with open source packages and stuff like that, there is, and people have put extensive amounts of checks and balances in place, particularly in like recent years, to try and mitigate the effects of just, random code appearing. And it is more or less working. Like they're still finding ways around. It's not like this is ever going to be a game that finishes, but we have a lot more protections. But Stack Overflow, which people know they shouldn't be using to like get code samples anyway, which they do. Can you imagine that as a supply chain attack vector? Like it's,
but
I don't know.
I think the interesting
we put it in the Perl.
I think the thing is though is that it doesn't even necessarily need to be someone with malicious intent. Like going back to what you were saying, Heidi,
Totally.
There's nothing more helpful than like a very motivated person who doesn't really understand the system that they're working with. And it's very easy to misinterpret or misunderstand how something is operating. And I think this ties in very well with that idea of abstraction that we were talking about earlier, where we've abstracted systems to a certain point where some people are beginning to lose context, or they've never learned the context in which these things operate. So they'll come into Stack Overflow, into GitHub issues, wherever, fully like thinking that they understand the system because they've read the docs, they've had a bit of a play, and they're like, well, actually, this is how you solve the problem. Like, this is how you solve a very complicated security problem. And it's like, sure, yes, but also absolutely not, because it's too general and it's not, tailored for the system that the other person is working with. And so, I think you can end up with those issues by proxy of that.
And further to that, Beck, sometimes the context that people don't have is actually like a background in like security or secure development, right? Like it might not even be a security problem. And I've seen this again and again where people they're just not viewing it through that lens. They've got a problem they're trying to solve. Like, oh, I need to encrypt this thing because my boss told me I need to encrypt it. How to do AES encryption in .NET, right? You can see how these things happen, right? And then you get code introduced into code bases that then potentially get widely used, and the actual, fundamental assumptions and logical design of the like security features are not well thought out. And then that gets documented because that's how it's implemented, and people are like, oh, well, it's been very well thought out. Here's the documentation, and like at no point are these assumptions tested. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting angle.
Yeah, it is. And I think it goes back to that whole, system thinking. Security is actually a lot more complicated than just technical controls. Right. There's like the people component and the culture component that, Heidi mentioned, and how we write things and talk about stuff. I also think that when it comes to security, I see in a lot of places, like you end up with these really long threads about the value or the merits of one very specific type of implementation. It just turns into bike shedding. And you
Do
sort
we
of
need to
like,
stop and define that?
I'm probably not the best person just to define bike shedding, but as I understand it, it's basically like where you nitpick, you take an idea and you just argue, or not argue, but you waste or spend a lot of time talking about aspects of it that aren't necessarily important. I think
What
that's
color the bike shed should be. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of
Yeah.
abstractions, the original of that is a group of people is tasked to check out the security of a nuclear power plant. And because they feel overwhelmed with the importance of that task, they focus on the bike shed and what color it should be. And so like it's abstractions all the way down, right? And now we're dealing with an entire generation that, because of the way we've designed things, doesn't understand file directories, like doesn't understand directory structure.
That
this is-
whole thing is super interesting to me, just as a thing where we it's not just like apocryphal. I am seeing this more with people who are joining the industry. Not that it's like, this is not an indictment on like kids these days or whatever. I think it's more systems these days are abstracting away the fun. Like, you don't get the knowledge of how the system operates is not imparted in the act of using the system. And I know people have probably been making this complaint since we stopped coding directly in assembly, but it's also...
Is this where I just like throw down my hat and say TCP/IP? No one understands TCP/IP anymore.
No,
Yeah.
no, they don't. And when the last of the people who do shuffle off into the dinosaur dying grounds, we're in big trouble.
It's all over. Yeah.
This argument started when we stopped like manually putting the grains of sand down to build the CPUs.
Yeah.
Shockingly,
We used to knit
to life,
programs
yeah.
into spaceships, and everything since then has been downhill.
But I think this is it.
No, go on, Beck.
Going to what you were saying, like you see it as well with like cloud. Cloud has been a fantastic avenue for this like abstraction. There are so many people that I know that, you know, they talk about, when they talk about DNS, they're talking about Route 53 and the intricacies of Route 53, the Amazon service, not necessarily DNS as a protocol.
No.
And because of that, you know, you lose a lot of the detail and importance to why it's there and why we made the decisions that we did. And so, like, again, this isn't a fault of anyone apart from like ourselves as an industry. Like, we've built these abstractions to make things more accessible to incoming engineers, but at the same time, we've never sort of taken the time to go, hey, so let me tell you a bit of the history behind this, or let me tell you a little bit about the RFCs and why some of these things came out of... Yes, Heidi, sorry.
Oh, so what we really need is better Minecraft lore for
yes
how systems.
I mean,
and
yeah.
actually, like the one group, the one cohort of people that I see coming up that really, really understand file structure and security are the modders, the game modders, because they've learned painfully how it works and how it doesn't. And I think it's just fascinating. Like, this is where we're going to get tomorrow's hackers, because they're the ones who are like, what happens if I take it apart?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that it's, I mean, this is sort of how we came up anyway with all of this stuff, is people trying and failing. And you say, you know, learning painfully. I think a lot of us learn things painfully. Like, that was the only way to really do it. So as we have strove? I don't know. As we strive.
Striven.
As we have striven to improve like the user experience and user interfaces, to make them more intuitive, to make them work for us, we're getting rid of a lot of the sort of fundamentals underneath it. Stovald, says Bash in the chat. I like it.
Is that like problem stovald? Like problem solved?
Problem solved.
Yeah.
We need stickers. But yeah, we're kind of like, we're improving the user experience. It's true. It's a lot better than it used to be. The experience doesn't have to be painful, but it doesn't change the way that it works under the hood. And if you want to understand software development and software security, you have to know how it works under the hood. I think the problem with security is that, at least from the stuff, the issues that I deal with day in and day out, have a lot to do with file systems permissions, honestly. Whether that is on an actual file system, or whether that is something like in Google Drive, where people are encouraged to kind of think of it as, I think, like a laundry basket of stuff that just can be searched and pulled out whenever you need it. And iCloud is the same. And it's just like, where's this file? I know it's called this. I'm going to grab it. But if you don't understand what folders are, for example, and whether a folder can be locked to a certain number of users or how the permissions work, then it gets kind of, the Swiss cheese thing works the other way, where you start to punch holes in all of these things. And it's very difficult to make it secure or to help people understand what you need to do in order to lock down a particular directory. Because the word directory is just kind of like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. And so I don't know how I don't know if we need to care about all that. Like, that is the most obvious answer. But maybe what we actually need is better guardrails so that you can't get to things. So the thing that happened when my baby Mater, who is now 19 years old, I don't know how that happened, when he took down the home Windows network for the third time as an 8-year-old downloading Minecraft mods, might have been Roblox, whatever. We're like, okay, that's the end of Windows for you. Welcome to Linux, my boy. Because there just aren't any, not none, but there's not a lot of like Roblox Linux mod viruses. And so instead of teaching him the abstraction as an 8-year-old of full security, we're like, okay, look, let's just give you a better sandbox. Something that's less
I enjoy that you essentially
dangerous.
sandboxed him. You're like,
Yeah.
you get yourself into trouble with this. Good job.
Mm-hmm. And it turns out
Not
he's a
even mad,
reasonably
I'm
competent
impressed.
Linux administrator and also super paranoid about his online presence. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if I screwed up, but
I don't know.
Not
Like,
talking
I
to the
feel,
right group of people to get an objective view on that, I think.
yeah, no.
Absolutely
James,
not.
James, to your comment, like, if you can like dig yourself into a problem in Linux, I can give you the speed run, and it's basically uninstall whatever Python version came with the system. And it's like, let me tell you, the first time I did that, and that's the thing, the first time I did that, it took me reading about 3 or 4 different Stack Overflow pages to realize how terrible of an idea that was, because there was nowhere in like the Debian docs, I'm pretty sure, that said, please do not do this. This is a terrible idea. It underpins
It's fully
every
critical.
single package here.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, do we have anti-docs? Are anti-docs a thing? Like, as in, like,
oh, so
you know,
that's a
I think-
really
please don't do
interesting thing.
this.
So
But
there's
I think-
actually, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, but I think that this is really interesting because, like, security tells you keep everything up to date. So, of course, you inherently get Debian, which is a system that always runs behind for stability purposes. And you're like, you're running Python 2.7. Well, that's going to be deprecated next year. I'm just going to install 3.9 over the top. No, don't do that. Let's create some anti-docs. Right,
So-
Heidi?
Yeah, so there are anti-docs. And interestingly, like, you know, when you're reading documentation and sometimes it says like warning and sometimes it says caution, there's actually settings for what those mean. And nobody ever tells you what they are. But like alert is this may cause you some problems. And warning is you may inadvertently lose some data. And caution, did I just mix this up? Or danger is people could get hurt. Don't fuck with it.
Right.
I think
but
you're
they're
just
not
blowing Beck's
interchangeable.
mind.
Well, this is the thing, is my favorite RFC is the RFC that defines the difference between must, should, and all of these things, because it's
so
a
good.
really important distinction when you're talking to people. And I found, like, even at work when talking about the things that security want, it's a lot easier to say you must do this and you should do this, because it's easy for them to go, okay, well, here's the 4 things that you say that I must do. Let's now prioritize that, instead of looking at this big long list of things that security have said, we want you to do this, and you've given them like clear definitions of these things. And so that RFC makes it really clear about what is absolutely expected of you and what you should consider. And I think it's the same thing with this. Like, you know, if I knew that critical means people will die, I'm definitely going to be paying more attention.
Thing is, though, that when you have something, and I find RFCs very aggressive to read because must and should are always in all caps, and it's like, why are you shouting at me? I just want to understand how this
Calm
header
down.
works. Oh my god!
Because no one reads the docs, Lily. So if you're scanning, the must
I know.
stands out.
Yeah, and then like the shoutier you get, the less people are going to be like, oh, sure, I'll do what you say, and probably more inclined to be like, well, screw you then. I guess I'm doing what I want. And I feel like this is where we come back to that like the sex ed analogy that Heidi was talking about, where it's kind of like you can't tell people what to do because even though you have a good idea of what it is and how it will help, they're not going to listen to you. And you got to have preventative measures in place regardless of whether they actually listen to what you're saying.
And so the must and should and shouting thing, at least in the US, our weather used to shout at us. And the National Weather Bureau would issue warnings that were like, perfectly fine day, 20 degrees Celsius, light winds. And you're like, okay. And you know, emergency large hurricane, your roof will leave, came across in exactly the same register. And I was like, why are we doing this? This is such terrible information communication. And the answer is because teletype machines. Because the whole system was predicated on teletype machines that would go chunk, 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 and print these bulletins out for remote stations where they didn't have the internet. And so the must and should in RFCs, I honestly wonder if they are also an artifact of older monitors where we didn't have lowercase letters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at a lot of the original RFCs, they are still served as text files, and you can see that they're formatted as text files where you only had, you know,
80
lowercase,
characters.
uppercase.
You don't have any of that fancy bold or italics or anything like that to highlight.
My first
or emphasize.
mobile phone could actually only send SMSs in caps. And
You were pro.
This was not a thing for all of my friends, so I was just perpetually shouting at all of my high school friends. And I kind of wish I could take that energy into what I do like day to day in my adult life. But anyway, yeah, like the technological limitation is a real thing.
But so it turns out we don't listen if they're always shouting. Like, I need to know hurricane is coming, your roof is going to leave. And I want that to be shouted. But if it's the same register, I don't know why she's like this evening. I hope you all enjoy the cats. But if it's the same register as perfectly nice day, yeah. I'm not listening. So one of the real problems of documentation is sort of the anti-docs, like, do not eject while drive is spinning. But we say that, but we don't say why.
Yeah.
Those to me, as an attacker or someone who pretends to be one for money, those are the things that interest me the most. The do nots. It's kind of like, oh, really? Yeah. Why not? And like all the things highlighted in red, I'm like, oh, well, what if I do then? Let's find out, I guess.
Well, this is always one of the things that I try and do is like when writing, because like I'm a big fan of using the little modals in like Confluence that like change color and you can put little emojis. And it's always like, you know, if something is red or yellow, explaining the why, like, don't do this because of this reason. I'm not going to stop you. And there's probably no control that's going to stop you, but you're going to find yourself in a bad time. And I'm on leave for the next 4 weeks. I don't want to hear about it. I put a note that told you not to do this for that reason.
So it's like
fascinating
deniability.
Yeah.
That works on some people, and some people do not read notes or anything that's a different color because it comes across as ads. And it's not that they're deliberately choosing not to read it. It's that they are so trained by the ad-mediated internet that they cannot read anything that is a text interruption.
So far, what I've taken from this conversation... Oh, James, you go. Oh, no, I was just going to say... So at 2 points so far, what I have taken away from this conversation is capitalism makes documentation bad. And I think this is a vibe.
Is capitalism the
there
problem?
It is. Boom.
Sometimes I play a game called DevOps Party Games. and we play ridiculous party games online. And I once won with somebody drew a picture of a person on fire, and I captioned it, "This works on my capitalism." And I think that it's not just about security, it's about the incentive structure of what we're asking people to do. Like, if there was no incentive to pop systems, we might not do it. Like, what do we get out of it for being hackers? There are rewards. What do we get out of reading documentation? Some reward, but probably less. What do we get out of writing documentation? Almost nothing. If we incentivized people to write documentation, if we gave them promotions for writing documentation, if we gave them like employee of the week, best documentation, we would get more documentation and it would be better. But instead it's like, okay, but where's my feature? Where's my feature? I can't sell documentation. Yeah. Where's my feature?
Yeah. And this is the same thing that you hear about security and when to introduce it into like a greenfields project is you can't sell security when there's no product to secure. Like, you know, it's great that we've rolled out MFA, but what are we protecting? We're protecting, you know, a profile page because that's as far as we got in the web app.
With documentation, you almost make the argument that I have made this almost.
We're getting some weird robot noises from you, James.
Yeah.
Great. Love that.
And it's an echo as well. I love technology.
It works on so many levels.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
James, while you sort that out, we'll continue this conversation and we can come back around.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we haven't really touched on is who the audience is for documentation. Like, is it developers? I think that's the assumption we've probably been making. And what we're talking about here is what happens when your documents get used by an audience that you didn't write them for. In this case, hackers. But when you're writing documentation, how much of that is actually in mind? I mean, I know that we also talk about the folks who have written a line of documentation specifically for the people who need to maintain the system while they're on holiday for 3 weeks. And that's an audience. But right. Yeah, how do we...
So interestingly, developers are seldom my primary audience. Even though I work for a developer, I'm not a technical writer right now, but like when I'm writing, I'm seldom thinking about developers entirely or exclusively. I'm thinking about system integrators, which is right up there next to sysadmins with like the code janitors of the world. And the number of times in anybody's life where they're actually creating novel code is so much smaller than the number of times that they are stitching together bits of other people's software to make a thing happen. And who I want to be writing for is the people who are trying to get this thing to work with this other thing, because that's a much broader audience. I've also done a ton of end user documentation. I was telling Lily about my first tech writing job where I worked for a video rental company, and the instructions had to be super clear on the difference between a monitor and a computer because those were interchangeable. Like, obviously, if I turned off the thing that shows me numbers, I have turned off the computer.
Right. Yeah, it's
right.
It's the picture of the computer.
It checks out. Totally checks out.
Yeah. So when I think about who I'm writing, this is the first question I write ask when I go to write documentation, and the last one I ask when I'm reviewing and reading it. Like, did I answer the likely question of a grumpy 50-year-old sysadmin who got told to install this?
I think on this as well, I think one of the things that we get caught up with a bit is that we don't need to write one doc for every audience. And I feel like when we try to, we just end up making one thing that's terrible for everyone. And, you know, we need to have, there's always going to be overlap, of course, but, you know, when you're someone new to a system, you have very specific needs and questions. When you're an intermediate user of the system, again, different needs and different requirements out of the information that you're told. And when you're an advanced user, you know, your needs are opened up even more. And I feel like we sort of do ourselves a disservice by trying to answer one question for a multitude of audiences.
Yeah, I feel like most of the docs I read are like the gluten-free vegan pizza of docs.
Ouch, that's terribly descriptive.
You know,
Yes.
like it's somebody, like everybody is going to be able to eat this. But how many people are actually going to want this thing specifically? Probably not very many. Certainly some, but probably not very many, even though everybody can eat it.
I feel like at least for me, the biggest observation that I've made is that we do really well for the people just starting out, and we do fairly well for the people who are more advanced, but we always seem to forget about the people who are in that awkward phase where it's like you're a little bit beyond the introductory concepts, but you still quite haven't understood enough to fall into that advanced category. And that's where I often find myself with documents being incredibly frustrated, because it's like I don't necessarily need the answers, but I need the crumbs that will lead me between these two territories.
It's like the picture of the owl. There's the two circles and the completed owl, but there's nothing of the intermediate steps.
Yeah,
I feel
exactly.
like, I know, Heidi, you and I, the other day we were talking about embroidery, we were talking about French knots and how to make French knots work. And you were saying, like, there are these YouTube tutorials and they're all showing me the thing, but I don't know how to get to the actual end point because they're missing a step in here and I don't know what it is. And then I think it was just like you figured it out yourself, right? In the end, by playing around a whole
pretty
lot.
much. Yeah, and by finding a tutorial written by somebody who was frustrated by the other tutorials. They're like the real answer. And so frequently that is the thing that Beck's talking about, the underserved middle, where I don't need the startup instructions. I have it mostly configured. I don't understand it, but I need it to do this one thing. And that's where you copy and paste from Stack Overflow.
Yeah. And this is the thing. It's actually really interesting because I started using Obsidian a fair few months ago. And for those that don't know, Obsidian is like a text-based editor that really works to make graphs of information. So you're not necessarily telling a linear story. It's like snippets of information that you can tie together. Which I found really helpful because it helps myself build those connections between, introductory concepts and advanced concepts, because I can take a page and link out to things and sort of build that image. But I think one of the things that I've struggled with is exactly this, because they're serving this really sort of awkward set of audiences. They have the people who are consuming the application as an editor. They have the people who are creating plugins for the editor, but then you have these people that are sort of stuck in the middle where their primary goal is to use the editor, but at times they might want to extend plugins or use really advanced functionality. And there's never a lot of context around it. And even like, you're like, oh, well, that's fine. Just go read the code, Beck. You know how to read code. You go read it and there's nothing there either. You just have to
that
go
is the
based
worst
off, like,
advice.
It's all like, method names, and to some degree, luckily, it's TypeScript, so you have some sort of type system that you can infer off. But again, you're coming back to that problem of I shouldn't have to make these assumptions and spend hours trying to get like simple functionality to work. We need to be putting some sort of priority on documenting these things. And I think part of the reason
my entire life as a Linux system administrator.
Yeah. Sorry, Heidi.
Oh, I was going to say, so what's the incentive to do that? Like, is Obsidian seeing a drop off in users at that stage? And so I now technically, as a developer advocate, work in marketing, and it's fascinating. Like, you're security people, you know this, but the things that people know about what you do on the web are so deep and so gnarly that honestly, I have to not think about it. It's sort of like I can't think about what's at the bottom of the ocean because it freaks my shit. I cannot think about what you can tell from my browser records. But also, I really love it when I know how far down the page somebody got before they stopped reading. Like, that's super valuable information to me. In the same way, Obsidian does or does not know is not paying attention maybe to the people who use it for several months, hit a progression plateau, and don't know how to get past it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like, it's a really active community, and like when you're talking about building things using the plugins, it's really vibrant and great, because people want to share those things. There's incentive to share and to try new things. But once you sort of get into building the plugins, again, like, you've got a pretty active community, because again, building stuff, being able to publish, but then for anyone in the middle, there's not a lot, because it's like, well, just build a plugin for it. Just do something as a consumer. Like, there's no need for you to make it this complicated. And it's like, I think there are a few assumptions here that we're making about what I'm trying to achieve. And I think it's like that, it's sort of been alluded to throughout this like whole conversation, but it's that calibrating with your audience, like calibrating what they need with what you can provide, and trying to understand where they're trying to get, so you're all at least on a similar page. You may not be able to solve the problem immediately for them, but if you can at least understand the journey that they're on, you can find overlap, or maybe do some bits and pieces to help, breadcrumb that trail. Yeah, so it's just very frustrating.
The interesting thing about a vibrant user community is that it's almost totally unsearchable, which is the worst. Thanks, Kat. That was very helpful. Pardon me.
Oh no!
I didn't need that light. It was extraneous to my needs.
Oh, Fury.
Fury is not feeling listened to and heard.
No, she's feeling unheard.
Yeah, we have not done enough documentation addressing Fury's needs.
Yes. So when I got started in tech writing 4 million years ago, the tool of choice was FrameMaker. And FrameMaker had a learning curve that was sort of like driving your car into a brick wall. It was just completely opaque. And there was an 800-page manual, and it didn't have everything in it. So you would join the Framers L list, and you would just watch other people have problems until your problem came up. Or if you were really stuck, really stuck, you would ask the problem. But it is from Framers L that I learned that there was a command where you pressed escape and M and P in succession, not together. And it would shrink the frame to the size of whatever you were trying to do. It was immensely useful. It literally appeared in no documentation. It was only tribal knowledge. And I was just like, how did Adobe forget to put that in the docs? And the answer is they never needed to, because they had this support structure of the user group, and
Everybody just knows
using it.
Yeah.
If you looked, the FrameMaker docs were laid out in InDesign.
Oh, that's telling.
I love that. Yeah.
It reminds me a bit of a couple of years ago when GitLab did an update, and they updated and said, "Hey everyone, good news! We've put Grafana on everybody's GitLab instances now, and have fun with that." And so, like you could look at pretty graphs, and that was great. But it was again one of those things where Grafana was then configured for everybody's self-hosted GitLab instance with the default creds, and it was only if you read the docs that you were aware that this would be a thing that you would have to turn on. Just kind of like, oh yeah, by the way, like the Grafana docs are the things that come along with this. The glue docs that go between are not, like, you'll just know. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, well, I guess you have Grafana. Yeah. Yeah.
Someone will be paged at 2:00 in the morning because someone has mentioned or found that there's a Grafana instance exposed. Have fun.
Yeah, and like certainly not speaking from any personal experience whatsoever. But I think that the community part of that sparked this thought for me was just how that, if you're not documenting these things at all and you assume that the community knows them, and then the community doesn't know them, when it's something like escape MP, okay, cool, you miss out on a really useful feature. When it's something like this, you end up exposing everybody's GitLab crap to the internet with default creds that anybody could find because it's at a predictable URL with predictable credentials, and have fun with that.
And any bet
Anyway,
it was
they
a
patched it,
predictable,
but
any bet it was a predictable URL and predictable credentials to make it more accessible to people just starting out.
Right. Like
Yeah.
good user experience.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we say the community, but more and more I am convinced that what we think of as the community is a tiny shred of an iceberg. There are people using our software who do not have fast internet, who are using it off USB sticks, who are using it on shitty computers with terrible graphics, who don't have the capacity to hit, 8888. They're not in charge of their DNS. They're behind a great firewall. And we assume that everybody is like us. And it's such a mistake.
Yep. I think as well, like one of the things since like we last spoke to you, Heidi, that I was thinking about in the back of my head was also that we tend to focus on making like English the primary language that we deliver docs in. And sometimes there are ideas and concepts, especially in technical writing, that just don't translate well via like DeepL or Google Translate. And that can also be a really big issue, like especially when you're talking about very abstract things. Like we have a lot of nuance to the English language that doesn't get communicated effectively. And so I think that adds an additional layer of complexity to that as well. Like it makes it really
Even
difficult.
the phrase like default password, right? Like we all know that a default password should be changed, but without that context, default means that it
Just
kind
means
of
ordinary,
should
right?
be, right. Like that's the
Yeah.
password. So if you're not
This
really
is
careful
why-
to translate that,
Yeah.
Yeah, this is why I'm really appreciative of like there are groups like the Localization Lab. I dropped a link in the chat that do this kind of stuff to help people overcome these kinds of issues when something is presented in a way that does not actually translate directly in their native language, and then you miss stuff. I feel like also it can be really interesting to acknowledge the number of Englishes things get written in as well. And I know that RFCs try and do this by creating a standardized language. So you have like RFC English with your must and your should and all of that. But particularly, like, I find documentation that is written in like Indian business English to be its own specific kind of thing. You have to realize that the documentation is written in that type of English to understand it. Otherwise, it doesn't make the same kind of sense that it would if you weren't reading it with that filter.
It's sort of like the markdowns, a thing that I will stay mad about forever, apparently, because I have not gotten over it. HTML was fine. Get good, scrubs.
Ooh, gauntlet.
I'm
thrown down.
feeling a little bit called out because I really like restructured, but it's like the entry for the level for entry is a lot higher than markdown is, and it's probably not as accessibly like documented as like HTML. So I'm in the probably weird bit where it's like it's nice that it works for you, but no one else cares. Thank you.
But we have all of these markdowns, and they just keep proliferating, and they're so similar, they're so close that it is almost worse than if they had distinctive like ideology. It's like our Englishes. Yeah, Lily. Like I do try and localize my English when I'm talking to Australians, because there are a couple American idioms that are just hilarious in Australian English. And
Also note you said Celsius earlier.
I did, and because I know that I'm talking to a mostly Australian audience, but it's it's fallible. Like I don't know. I am possibly also somebody from Singapore is going to watch this, and that's a different English.
Yeah,
I feel
I was
like-
also looking. Sorry, Beck. I was just looking at the URL that I'd pasted in there, and Localization Lab with a Z or Z in it.
Z.
Yeah, which is not the phrase that I Googled because I typed it differently, because in my English, that's not how you spell localization.
Helping.
I feel
Sorry,
like one
Beck.
of the no. I was just gonna say I think one of the really interesting things that like I hear through this whole conversation is it's very similar to dealing with recipes. And a lot of these problems are shared with recipes. And I think that's interesting because like a lot of our documentation, if you abstract it, is like a technical recipe. This is how you set up an app. This is how you do this. This is how you accomplish that. And so like, you know, it's those small distinctions between, are we talking about like imperial cups or the other type of cup? Because I know that there's a difference, but I don't know what it is. And when you read
there's
American
a Japanese
recipes,
cup.
There we go.
This is why your rice cooker is weird.
See,
This is blowing my mind.
Knowledge.
Yeah, the little cup they
sharing.
give you with the rice cooker is not a
Standard cup.
well, it's not an American cup anyway, but that's what the lines are calibrated on.
Oh, look at that. But like, I guess this is a really good, like, if I feel like it's one of those things of like, if the audience doesn't take anything away from this conversation, or is like, I still don't understand why documentation is such a big thing. Just think about all of the times that you've tried to get a recipe from an American website and then tried to cook it in your Australian kitchen, and you've had to like convert a million things, and vice versa. Like, think about all the times where you've had to translate a recipe because it's like from a foreign country and all of the steps don't make sense to you. I feel like it's a bit of a reductionist example, but I think it demonstrates some of the key difficulties.
So on a sort of step up level from that, I gave a talk about knitting at Seattle Linux. And there are, in older knitting patterns, there are all these expectations about what you know. And the newer the knitting pattern is, the more explicit it gets, because we can't assume that people were taught knitting in school. Like, it used to be a fair assumption that everybody, at least all of the girls, had been taught knitting, basically. And now we have to write for people who are like, do I use one stick or two?
You can do knitting with
I've
one
found
stick.
the same with sewing cotton.
Well, no, but you can try.
I see now who the instructions are written for.
So I guess we've kind of reached the end of the time that we promised our viewers that we would stop. I feel like we have a lot more to say though, so I don't mind if we want to keep going. I'm just sort of wondering, in terms of, you know, how security practitioners can enhance their effectiveness, I guess, in terms of documentation. How do we, what can we give people that gives them some kind of hope amidst the despair and the unknowns and the weirdnesses? Like, if all docs are kind of fundamentally broken and there's no one universal language and people aren't going to read them, or people are going to read them but for the wrong reasons, like what do we do about that?
I think we get more Swiss cheese. We build better bumpers. We make documentation one of the bumpers, but we also add in things that say, hey, did you really mean to type that? Like, did you know that that's a production credential? Let's not commit it. Like, I think we've all seen something like that where it's like, currently I have a notification on my computer that says, do you know you have your restore code saved on your computer? Would you please stop? And that's a bumper. Like, okay, that is actually something that I need to be told, obviously, because I did download the PDF and store it on my computer. Okay, that's a thing that is not documentation, but it's also not the product. It's something in the experience bubble.
Yep. I feel like as well, it's also, I think one of the things is that, you know, security folks should probably spend a little bit more time on caring about docs. And I think that's especially true when we talk about open source, because as we were talking about with Incentive, you know, you already have open source projects that the developers and the engineers working on it are probably already so busy just trying to live life, maintain like a package is being used, triage issues. And, you know, if you have a bit of time or you're using this package and you run into like security concerns or security issues, like help with that if you have the time or the spoons or the forks. Like,
I read a relevant tweet to this earlier today, Beck, where it was someone described open source software maintenance as Goodwill Hunting in reverse, where you start a genius and end up a janitor getting into fights.
Yeah, the other one that I've seen that's really good for, like, it's open source. It's like free software is in free mattress, not free beer.
Oh God.
And
Yep.
like,
Yes.
and it's like, yeah, I feel like we all sort of take open source for granted, and then we sort of sit there and like, all of the docs are crap and there's no security, like, weave through these stories. And it's like, help weave that story then. If you see something, say something and help out.
Not that we're beating up on GitLab on this at all, but there was another relevant example, and it wasn't actually code that GitLab had put out there in the open source world. It was actually an Ansible role that someone else had written to install GitLab, and it had a default hard-coded root password, and it said in big blinking lights in the markdown, change the default password. And so a bunch of people scanned the internet for GitLab installations with that password, and guess what? So that Ansible role now automatically generates a new password. So that's like a technology problem to a documentation issue. But I think it's a good example of how when you're just trying to do the MVP thing and get some software out there, and you're like proceeding in good faith and actually putting some software out there to help people, you know, providing whatever time you can to do that, you might not necessarily have even time to just go and put best practice in place for that documentation, or put the technology. Like, I think there's a tendency for people to be like, oh, well, it says in the docs, like, change the password, rather than quote unquote doing it properly. So
yeah, I think internally as well, like, as you said, or as you mentioned, Heidi, like, you know, writing good docs a part of the promotion process. Like, consider those contributions, whether they're internal to like the team or group or the wider company or externally, making those things not glue work and making them like count for being real work. Because I think one of the things that we forget is like communicating a lot of these technical things is not actually easy. It's really quite hard
work
because like you're delivering a static thing at the end. Like, you can't sit there and be like, so actually what I meant here was, and like answer questions as you go. Like, you don't have that opportunity. Lily.
I think, yeah, no, one of the things that that I think is really interesting here, and I realize I'm prefacing everything I'm saying with like one of the things or blah, but it is that I think, I don't know, I get intimidated by writing documentation because I'm like, well, I have to have like a full wiki basically that has every possible outcome and so on and so forth. And it's either going to be some boilerplate template of like, run this command and then this command and you're good, or you know, like a 12-page thing that will describe perfectly every outcome and there's no middle ground. So how do we make it better for documentors to do this?
Iterative improvement. Like, first make a place that it should go, and then make a terrible version, and then make a slightly better version. It's not like anybody writes the code right the first time. You write a test for it, and you meet the test. And there's no reason you can't write tests for documentation. As a novice user, I want to be able to install this thing. And I use those tests, I put them at the bottom. Like, when you complete these steps, you will know you have done it right if you can. By the way, I'm holding the cat up to the microphone on purpose for all the fans.
Okay, good. Yeah, I am
Only
really enjoying this.
Only pairs.
Yeah, this
It's
is no
gonna
longer
be
a
the new
security
offshoot.
stream. This is...
No.
Yeah.
I think the
I
other
would like
thing,
to get
Lily,
the cat back.
I think one of the observations on that, and I feel like I've spent my whole like past 2 weeks being like, have you considered that maybe other people's expectations are excessive? Like, you know, if if you're putting out software as any sort of like, if you're a business, whether you're an open source contributor, and people are expecting perfectly mapped out documents with the most amazing and revolutionary information architecture, I think there's an expectation there that it's like too high. It needs to be recalibrated, and not everything can be instant delivery, instant satisfaction, like click, click, click. And I feel like this is a capitalism thing. Just really quietly.
Just to tie it all up.
Yeah. In the words of a cartoon show, the first step to not sucking at something is sucking at it. So, get something in there, and it is better almost always, not always, but almost always better to have something than nothing.
I've heard you talk about this in the context of dog training, Heidi. Mm-hmm. Like, it's the same deal, right? Probably not a flattering way to talk about our colleagues, but
the best management book I've ever read is The Power of Positive Dog Training, because it talks about identifying the behavior you want and rewarding it. And I don't understand why we don't say that to more managers. I'm like, tell me what you want and then make it feel good to do it. Okay?
I feel like if you want to get into like a management track, you should have to look after like a rescue cat for a year, because like it's a very effective way of learning and understanding good communication skills. The cat will tell you one thing and you need to learn very quickly what that means. I think as well, if you're, and I say this as someone who is consistently working on trying to get my team members to do more documentation, it's like also reassuring them that like, and this is the thing that I always say to them. They'll be like, oh, where should I put this page? Or like, should I lay it out a particular way? I'm like, I really don't mind the way you do it. Make it make sense for you. Like, tell your story and we can contribute to it. There's nothing that you can do wrong except delete the whole Confluence space. And even that is probably negotiable because there's probably a backup somewhere.
The thing I like to do to lower that barrier to entry is to make it a template. Almost all the documentation we need could be templatized. And it's just like writing a bug report. Like, I was trying to use this software when it did this unexpected thing. Help. So documentation can be the same thing. So you want to install this. Here are the pieces you need. Here are the places they go. Here's how you know if it worked. And writing it like a bug report, I think, is a lot more comfortable than facing the blank page and trying to come up with headings.
Yeah. And signposting, I think. I really like, I'll do whole docs and 90% of it will be incomplete, but I'll put like coming soon or out of date and at least indicate that like there is something, but you're also more than welcome to fill it out if you like.
Do you have a GIF of the little under construction man from the 90s web?
No, but I feel like that is something that I might need to do now. Yeah. I think about it as gardening, not landscaping, which I think is like that, incentivizing the outcome that you want. Like, go pull off some dead flowers off the plant so you can encourage it to bloom more or give you more fruit or something. But also we accept gardening as work that needs to be done incrementally. Like, you have to go mow the lawn every X weeks, or especially after the rain. And docs are the same. You don't necessarily need to enjoy it, but you do sort of have to do it.
Yeah. So, okay, I feel like we've covered this off in as much as we can definitively say anything about it at all. Can you folks, well, actually, Heidi, I don't know if you have the actual, no, you probably don't have the hand capacity to hold up the book again, but we've got the banner going on, so.
Watch this.
Oh my God.
I've been a parent. Docs for developers.
Yes. So please go and read it. If you're a developer, if you're a hacker, whatever you do, I reckon it will probably help. Either that or the dog training manual will probably be, where you need to go. We have heard your feedback about Director Fury the cat, and we'll see what we can do about getting her back for future.
Keep your eyes out for OWASP DevSlop only pers.
All right. Are you ready for your close-up, Director Fury?
Aww.
You should see how fast she is wagging her tail because she's angry at me. Her natural state is angry.
Yep. I love it. She's beautiful.
She is?
Is there anything else that you want to tell the folks who are watching before we go, Heidi?
I think that the thing I want everybody to remember is that you're not a bad person for having failed to do documentation, and you're not a good person for having done it. It's just a thing that makes your software a little safer for everybody.
I love that. Thank you.
No moralizing of writing here.
Nope. None.
Generally, really good advice, I think, about software development in general. Okay, well, I guess that's a wrap. And yeah, thanks you all for joining us for another episode. We hope you found it informative and had as much fun as we did putting the show together. Make sure you follow us on Twitch and the socials to keep up with upcoming shows. And don't forget to join our Discord to keep the conversation going. Links are in our Twitch channel down and the YouTube show description. So until next time, we'll see you later.
Thanks, folks.